The Ukrainian landscape is scarred by war. For over 2 years, the conflict between Ukraine and Russia has continued, a brutal testament to the fragility of peace. The conflict, which began with Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014, sharply escalated in 2022, plunging the region into violence and forced displacement. Millions have fled their homes, seeking refuge from the relentless shelling and drone strikes. The international community watches with bated breath, hoping for a swift resolution to this humanitarian crisis. The conflict has devolved into a war of attrition, with both sides locked in a deadly struggle. Ukraine, backed by the West, is putting up a staunch resistance, demonstrating a resilience that has surprised many. However, Russia's military might and vast resources pose a formidable threat. This conflict has exposed cracks in the global order, testing alliances and raising serious questions about the future of international security. Against this backdrop of conflict, a glimmer of hope emerged in the most unlikely of places: Jeddah, Saudi Arabia. Diplomats and officials converged on this desert kingdom for a series of high-stakes talks, seeking to bridge the divide between Ukraine and Russia. The eyes of the world turned to these talks, hoping for a breakthrough that could pave the way to peace. The stakes were incredibly high. For Ukraine, the talks represented a chance to secure much-needed support from the United States, its most powerful ally. The Trump administration, known for its pragmatic approach to foreign policy, had earlier that year suspended military aid to Ukraine. President Zelensky, facing mounting pressure at home, needed a tangible sign of American support to bolster his government's position. The United States, for its part, arrived in Jeddah with its own set of objectives. The Trump administration, eager to reduce America's overseas commitments, saw an opportunity to broker a peace deal that would allow the United States to extricate itself from the Ukrainian quagmire. Additionally, the administration was interested in gaining access to Ukraine's vast reserves of rare earth minerals, crucial components in the manufacturing of advanced technologies. The talks were fraught with tension and mistrust. Ukraine, wary of making concessions that could be perceived as weakness, sought concrete guarantees from the United States. The United States, in turn, pressed Ukraine to consider a realistic peace, a euphemism for potential territorial concessions to Russia. The specter of a protracted conflict with its inevitable human and economic costs loomed large over the negotiations. At the heart of the negotiations lay Ukraine's proposal for a partial ceasefire. This proposal, carefully calibrated to address both Ukrainian and American interests, focused on de-escalating the conflict in key areas. First and foremost, Ukraine proposed a halt to drone strikes and long-range missile attacks. These strikes, while inflicting casualties on both sides, had taken a particularly heavy toll on civilian infrastructure, exacerbating the humanitarian crisis. Secondly, Ukraine proposed restrictions on military operations in the Black Sea. This strategic waterway, crucial for Ukrainian grain exports and the projection of Russian naval power, had become a flashpoint in the conflict. By limiting naval activity, Ukraine hoped to reduce the risk of accidental escalation and create a more stable security environment. Section 5. The price of peace. The proposed ceasefire, while offering a glimmer of hope, came at a steep price for Ukraine. The United States, in exchange for the resumption of military aid and intelligence sharing, demanded concessions from Ukraine. These concessions, shrouded in diplomatic ambiguity, reportedly centered on Ukraine's willingness to cede control of the Donbas, a vital industrial heartland currently under Russian occupation. The potential concessions sparked outrage in Kyiv, with many accusing the United States of abandoning Ukraine in its hour of need. The prospect of territorial concessions touched a raw nerve in Ukraine, evoking painful memories of Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014. President Zelensky, torn between the desire for peace and the need to preserve Ukraine's sovereignty, faced an agonizing dilemma. Section 6. America's stake. The United States' involvement in the talks in Saudi Arabia underscored the high stakes for Washington. The conflict in Ukraine, though geographically distant, had profound implications for American interests. First and foremost, the conflict had emboldened Russia, challenging the post-Cold War security architecture in Europe. The Biden administration, wary of Russian expansionism, was determined to contain Moscow's ambitions. Secondly, the conflict had exposed the fragility of the rules-based international order. Russia's blatant violation of Ukraine's sovereignty had shaken the foundations of international law and raised fears of a return to an era of great power competition. The United States, as a guarantor of the post-war order, felt obligated to respond decisively. Section 7. Rubio and Waltz, architects of diplomacy. Two key figures emerged as central players in the American delegation: Secretary of State Marco Rubio and National Security Advisor Mike Waltz. Rubio, known for his hawkish stance on foreign policy, brought his deep knowledge of the region and his experience in navigating complex diplomatic negotiations. Waltz, a highly decorated war veteran and former Green Beret, provided invaluable military expertise, helping to shape the U.S. position on the proposed ceasefire. Their presence reflected the Trump administration's desire to strike a deal that would advance American interests. Rubio, a vocal critic of Russian aggression, pushed for a hard line against Moscow, advocating for increased military support to Ukraine. Waltz, in turn, brought a pragmatic perspective, emphasizing the need to balance Ukraine's aspirations with the realities on the ground and the importance of averting a wider conflict. Section 8. The road ahead. As the talks in Jeddah concluded, the road ahead remained uncertain. The proposed ceasefire, while a positive step, represented only the first tentative steps on a long and arduous journey toward lasting peace. Deep divisions persisted between Ukraine and Russia, fueled by years of mistrust and bloodshed. The international community, weary of the conflict, hoped that the Jeddah talks would mark a turning point in the Ukrainian crisis. However, the path to peace was fraught with obstacles, and the specter of renewed violence loomed large. The coming weeks and months would test the resolve of all parties involved as they sought to transform the fragile hope of peace into an enduring reality. Section 9. A fragile hope. The outcome of the talks in Saudi Arabia, while not conclusive, offered a glimmer of hope in an otherwise bleak landscape. The proposed ceasefire, if implemented, could provide a much-needed respite from the violence, allowing for the delivery of humanitarian aid to those in need and creating space for constructive dialogue. However, the path to peace is fraught with uncertainty. The international community must remain engaged, providing diplomatic and economic support to both Ukraine and Russia, encouraging them to choose the path of dialogue over confrontation. The stakes are too high to allow for failure. The future of Ukraine, and indeed the stability of the entire region, hangs in the balance.